Okay, now, first things that we need to do. So let's do this now. If you're using your iClicker remotes, the first thing you do when you walk into the lecture hall every morning is set your frequency to AC. Does everybody know how to change frequency on their remote? Okay, if you're using the Reef app on your smart device, open the app, choose this course, and tap join. So everybody does that first thing as soon as you come in and sit down so that you're ready. Now, one of the things that we'll do every morning is I will give you or show you a slide that will have Angela's SI times listed on it. If she makes a little video or something, I'll show that to you to keep you updated on that. She will keep in contact with you through email in Blackboard, so be looking for messages from her as well. The other thing that we'll do is we'll usually start off with some type of little quiz, kind of like this. You'll always know that it's a quiz because the slide has a yellow background. Then I will open up the polling session and you will have 45 seconds to choose your answer. Ouch, that sounded bad. Okay, we're in the red zone, less than 10 seconds. Okay, then I'll show you the results. The correct answer, of course, is E. Both B and D. At least somebody said A, which at least that's honest. It's not the correct answer. But remember, successful college students always take notes, always take lots of notes. And so that's one of the habits that I want to get you into starting today. Now, today's iClicker quizzes, and we'll practice with a few more of them, are for bonus points. If you're up, you're ready, you got the device going on time and early, then you deserve a little bit of a break. We start using them for real and start counting points on Tuesday, the 22nd. So if you're not up to speed on iClicker yet, make sure you are by Tuesday so you don't lose easy points. The other thing that I want to point out to you is that a number of you have not yet signed up and registered for LearnSmart. Your first assignment, your Chapter 1 assignment, is due at midnight on Tuesday, the 22nd. And it is not possible for me to open it up again after the time has expired. So make sure that you've at least registered with that 14-day free trial so that you can start working on Chapter 1. Now, today we're going to pick up a topic that moves along with Chapter 1, America before Columbus. One of the very first lies that you were taught about American history. Columbus discovered America. This is what we call a Eurocentric point of view, meaning this is how the Europeans tell the story, that Columbus was the first to discover the Americas. And then your teacher says, and when he got here, he met some people and he called them Indians. And you're like, what, 6, 7 in first or second grade? And you're already starting to think, Well, how could he be the first if there were already people here? That's when you started becoming cynical. That's when you realized for the first time that people lie to you sometimes. Columbus was clearly not the first human to get here. He was the first European to make the discovery of what we call the New World or the Western Hemisphere. Now, when you get into chapter 1, just a couple of pointers for you as you engage this material. First off, don't try to memorize all the names of all of the tribes that Hansen throws out at you. That's not what I'm trying to get you to learn. Instead, what I want you to kind of focus on are the connections between these different groups, how they create trade networks and share information amongst themselves, very much like we do today with electronic devices. I want you to notice the complexity or lack of complexity as you compare and contrast different groups. For instance, the Aztecs, highly complex versus some of the Plains Indian tribes that are not so complex. And account for what reasons or why they're in different stages of some type of social development. I want you to focus on the rise and fall of these different groups, how some come to power and then kind of fade away, like the mound building cultures, and then later the Cahokia culture based on the Mississippian culture, how it comes, how it goes. Now, for this point, who are the Indians? This was a point of immense concern for the Europeans once they got here. They're trying to figure out who these people are. Now, the Europeans at this point, 1492, are familiar, obviously, with other Europeans. They're familiar with the Arabic peoples in the Mideast. They're familiar with African peoples from sub-Saharan Africa and other Arabic peoples from northern Africa. But they've never run into anybody like these American Indians. And so there's lots of explanations that they'll come up with, trying to explain who the Indians are. One of the popular explanations that was floating around is that the Indians were the survivors of the lost continent of Atlantis. Okay, good college students are always taking notes. Not just writing down bullet points, but constantly moving that pen and that pencil. The lost continent of Atlantis, that distant, hazy myth that had this advanced civilization sometime in the past that somehow, for some reason, disappeared, and a number of Europeans concluded that, well, perhaps a few of the Atlantans survived, and the Indians are their descendants. Well, it makes a good story, but there's no evidence to back it up. Another popular explanation was that the Indians are the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Remember, Europeans are steeped in Christianity, and the Bible discusses the Israelites leaving their captivity in Egypt, wandering across the desert for 40 years, looking for the promised land, and somewhere along the way, 2 of the 12 tribes split away and were never seen again. And so Europeans concluded that perhaps the Indians are the descendants of these lost tribes of Israel. Again, a good story, but no real evidence to back it up. So we continue to try to identify who these folks are. Now, the best theory, the best explanation that we have to date It's what's known as the migration theory. This is the best explanation to date because we have good, solid evidence to back this up. Now, just as a pointer to you, when you see stuff on the PowerPoint slide that's red and underlined, that doesn't mean anything to you. It doesn't mean that that's more important than everything else on the slide. It simply means it's a hyperlink to an image that I want to show you. Well, this migration theory says that the first humans to reach the New World, the Americas, came through a land bridge known as Beringia. Okay, I'll have to try to, it's bad enough with handwriting. Now I'm having to do it with a mouse. This little place right here, the sea bottom linking Asia to the Americas. About 40,000 years ago, in the last ice age, most of the world's water was held up in glaciers, and it exposed the seafloor. And so the first humans to get to the Americas came from over here in Eastern Asia, from all over here. Hunter-gatherer tribes of different people would come as they followed the animals they hunt, would cross back and forth across Beringia for thousands of years. And it was no big deal. They'd follow the animals that they hunted. The animals would turn around and go the other direction. The humans would turn around and follow them. And so there was this pattern of multiple migrations over long periods of time. Then you've also got a whole bunch of these different groups originating in different places across Eastern Asia. And so there's not just one group that's making these migrations. There's multiple groups, perhaps as many as a couple of thousand groups. Then there's going to be multiple migrations. There's also an idea and some evidence to support it that there was a water migration as well. Now, right about here is where the glaciers came down to from the north. And so there's some evidence that some of these Asian nomads popped along the ice shelf as they were hunting seal and fishing and things like that, made it to the west coast of the Americas, popped along until they get all the way down into South America. There's an archaeological site off the coast of Peru that's now underwater that was a settlement, a village that Native Americans had created probably about 10,000 years ago. Now, one of the things that's happening here is that these Native Americans are coming from different points in Asia over many years here. Now, the evidence that we use is pretty solid. We have archaeological evidence. We have stone tools and pottery that date from the same time period that we find them in Asia with the same time period that we find them here in the Americas. And so we know with the geological stratification that these tools arrived probably about the same time that people in Asia were using these tools. We have human remains, skeletons. that show extremely similar features, biological features, such as skull shape and dental patterns that date from the same time periods, both in Asia and the Americas. And then, a few years ago, we got the smoking gun, DNA. Native Americans share a very large number of genetic markers with people of Asian descent. And so it's almost conclusive that the first Americans were these Asian nomads. One of the oldest stories, then, in American history is cultural diversity. Now, I know that's a controversial topic today, but when you look at the historical record, you can't escape this conclusion that there's a great deal of diversity. The anthropologists tell us that when Columbus arrived in the New World, that there were over 2,000 distinct American Indian cultures, spread all the way from the Arctic down to the very tip of South America. And none of them are exactly the same. The only consistency among these groups is that they're inconsistent. Now, this can be explained through a variety of reasons. One, the multiple migrations originating in different points of Asia. But then you also have what we refer to as diffusion. And here you're going to have this diffusion, this spread, in two ways. One, of course, is geographical. These people move all across the continent. When the last ice age ended about 10,000 BC, Beringia flooded. And now those Asian nomads that are here in the Americas get trapped. They can't get back, so the only place they can go is east and south. And so they move. And by 1492, probably much, much earlier than that, but certainly by 1492, when Columbus arrives, there's people living all across both continents. And so there's this geographical diffusion. There's also environmental factors that account for this diversity. North America alone is very environmentally diverse. Different climates. And that requires people to do things differently. For example, when we're all big game hunters up in the cold northern parts of Canada or the northern parts of what becomes the United States, we all have to wear heavy animal skin robes to keep warm. But now, when we migrate down, say, to Corpus Christi, where it's warm most of the time, we don't need to wear heavy animal skin robes. And so these environmental factors that people encounter will either force them to change the way they do things, or it will allow them to do things differently. Some people find it and they don't like it. They're forced to change. Other people embrace these changes. And so it's a group decision of what to do here. Now, in terms of cultural diversity, let's kind of define what we mean here. Now, when you take an anthropology course, you'll of course get a much more detailed, accurate, perhaps, definition of culture. But for our purposes, it simply means widely shared ways of doing things. Give me an example of culture. Somebody throw it out there. Widely shared ways of doing things. Religion, the gods that we worship and the rituals that we create are all different based on different groups, right? And that's a sign of culture. Good. What else? Food, the foods that we eat. Not everybody eats the same stuff, and so there's a great variety that distinguishes cultures simply based on the foods they eat. Good. What else? Leadership, political structures. Sometimes very complex, sometimes very simple, sometimes authoritarian, sometimes more democratic. Exactly. Good. What else? Music. The songs that we sing, the music that we create, the art that we create is culturally distinguished. You get the idea, right? So what we have then are about 2,000 different cultures that we can identify through things like food and religion and music and art and dress and political structures, things like that. So this is really the single oldest story, along with this idea of immigration. So I don't know why we're so surprised about it today. Now we go back and we look at these American Indians. As they transition, because, well, they can't get back to Asia, now they're Americans, and by Columbus's error, they become known as Indians. We think, and many of the Europeans at the time, thought that these people didn't have technology. Because, well, they didn't have European or Western world technology, such as the wheel and the harness and the plow. And that makes sense because they don't have domesticated animals to use these tools with. So when Columbus gets here in 1492, he encounters Native American Indian cultures that are Stone Age when compared to Europe. The American Indians hadn't learned how to smelt metals yet to make bronze or iron. And so the Europeans used this concept of technology to determine that American Indians are therefore inferior and uncivilized because they don't have the same technologies that the Europeans had. Now, the Native Americans had technology. They made tools. That's one of the basic features that separates our species from all of the other animals. We have the ability to make tools, things that make our lives easier, that make some particular task faster or less dangerous. And so the Native Americans had technologies, and they had technologies that not only allowed them to survive, but allowed them to grow and prosper as well. Even though they are less advanced than what the Europeans were. For example, one of the things that's relatively common and one of the sets of artifacts that we have are spear points, what we know as the Clovis or the Folsom technology. And these are named after the archaeological sites where they were found. The Clovis technology, these spear points here on the left, and the Folsom points here on the right, are different types of spear points that Native Americans use, and it's very similar to what the folks back in Asia from this time period are using. And these allow the Native Americans, you can see how this Folsom point was found in the rib of some large animal. These stone tools allowed Native Americans to hunt efficiently, and they could provide food for themselves. There's two things that all creatures have to do, whether we're human or any other creature. We have to stay warm and we have to eat. And the Native Americans had developed technologies that allowed them to do both of those things. Another set of technologies are known as the Plano technologies. Now, I don't think this has anything to do with Plano, Texas. These are cutting and grinding tools, along with digging tools. So stone knives and stone axes, stone shovels. Another way that Native Americans are able to harvest plant foods. Now, not all Indians use these same technologies, because we've got another set here used by different cultural groups that are known collectively as the desert technologies. And these desert technologies are primarily carrying or storage tools. Now, all of these Native Americans, up to a certain point, were what we call hunter-gatherers. They hunted and they gathered food as they found it. And in some regions, these food items, especially the plant items, are easy to find. It's everywhere. Other places, more arid, drier, hotter places, like Arizona, New Mexico, South Texas, not quite as readily available. So when you find a large patch of strawberries, you eat as much as you can, and then you harvest more to put into a basket to carry with you as you go looking for more food or other animals to hunt. You know, snacks to take on your road trip, right? Or storage tools to hold water, and this is especially important in the desert Southwest. And so the Native Americans had technologies. They're just not the same level of technologies that the Europeans had. And so to judge them as uncivilized and inferior is really not fair. Remember, different culture groups use different technologies. Now, a couple of times during class, every day, usually at the end of the slide, sometimes in the middle of the slide, but usually at the end, I will ask you a quiz question. And then I'll show you the choices. Give you a second to get your device out. And then I'll start the poll. The great diversity among Native Americans can be partially explained by, you're free to consult your notes. You're free to consult with each other and discuss this, why you think one answer is correct or one's wrong. All right, we're in the red zone. All right, correct answer is E. Very good. All of these are correct. Different points of origin in Asia, geographical diffusion, environmental factors, multiple migrations over long periods of time. All of this account for the diversity that we see among native peoples. This will bring us then to the topic of the agricultural revolution. Now at this point, since we're not doing quizzes, your smart device should be upside down in your lap, because that will prevent you, any other way will prevent you from taking notes. This agricultural revolution is one of the most important things that have ever happened in history. It's the point in time when humans learned how to farm, learned how to intentionally grow plants when and where they want them to grow for a constant food source. So on your list of the most important things that have ever happened, the agricultural revolution needs to be on that list, and it needs to be pretty high up on that list, because nothing is the same afterwards as it was before. This is a total game changer in terms of humans and our adaptation to the environment. Now this pops up at various places around the world at about the same time, but the first evidence that we see here in the Americas is central Mexico, about 7,000 years before the present, or 5,000 BC. Central Mexico, the highlands of central Mexico. We see it happening about the same time in what is now modern-day Israel. We see it happening now, about the same time in what is today southeastern China. And so humans adapted to this and picked it up relatively quickly, but independently. There's probably not more than about 1,000 years difference when we see agriculture first appear in other parts of the world until Native Americans discovered it as well. We don't know exactly how this started. It could have been purely by accident. Or we humans are sometimes pretty observant and pretty clever creatures. We could have simply observed that the parts of a plant that are buried in the ground turn out to grow new plants. And so through a process of discovery and experimentation, American Indians learned how to farm about 7,000 years ago. Now you have to understand that New World agriculture is plant agriculture only. Native Americans are not herdsmen. They have no domesticated animals. They don't have cows and pigs and chickens and goats and sheep. Because the animals native to the Western Hemisphere don't lend themselves to domestication. And so Native American agriculture is plant-based only. They won't become herdsmen and start raising livestock until the Europeans get here. So this is an important distinction to make. Now, this Native American agriculture is going to be based on a handful of crops. And these are going to be widely distributed, widely grown in a lot of different culture areas. But some plants grow better in some climates than others do. And since we're here in central Mexico 7,000 years ago, the crops that grow best are the ones that are listed here. Now, don't write these down, don't memorize this, but understand what these particular plants do. They grow primarily in warmer climates. So the southern part of what becomes the United States, the eastern part, the western coasts where the climate is more temperate. And then they provide a great deal of protein. The three most important crops here are maize, or maize for us gringos, corn, beans, and squash. And together, these are known as the three sisters. And these plants especially grow well in a lot of different climate zones, and different groups adopt these particular plants. And it serves as the basis for this agricultural revolution. Corn, beans, squash, together with just even small amounts of meat, provide enough protein to sustain a healthy human body. Now, the result then is more food. And more food means healthier people, and healthier people tend to have more babies, and those babies tend to be healthier, which makes growing populations. And so there's a chain reaction of events here as this agricultural revolution unfolds. Is this a risk or is this a benefit? And the correct answer is, well, it depends. From a European point of view, agriculture was the first sign of civilization. People move from savagery and barbarism to civilization when they start farming. This is why when you take your world history courses, sometimes they talk about the cradle of civilization, modern day Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates River. Well, because that's where we see some of the first examples of agriculture on a wide scale. And so the Europeans believe that civilized people farm. Uncivilized people hunt and gather. And it was always assumed that as people became civilized, they would naturally adapt or adopt agriculture. Now, the archaeologists and anthropologists give us a different model to work with that explains why some American Indian groups never adopted agriculture as their primary means of support. They thought it was too risky. Consider the risks. Your group has decided that you found a nice spot where corn and beans and squash grow wild, and you figured out how to cultivate them to grow more of this stuff, and you decide you're tired of wandering around, going days being hungry because you haven't killed any animals to eat or found anything to harvest. And so it seems like this might be a good idea, but consider the risk. What happens if it floods at the wrong time? Or you don't get enough rain at the proper times? What happens if wild animals trample your crops? Then your harvest doesn't come in. And that sets up hunger, perhaps starvation. And some groups then decide that, relying on agriculture is just too risky. We're not going to do it. We'd prefer to hunt and gather. On the other hand, groups that do successfully pull off agriculture have a number of benefits. One is certainly growing populations, stronger, healthier people. But it also has a political and an economic aspect to it as well. Our group has decided to settle here in this room, and we're growing plants and we're feeding ourselves and we're all happy. But the group next door still continues to hunt and gather. Or maybe their crops failed this year and they're facing starvation. We've got surpluses of food that we can use as a weapon, if you will. We can force these other people to submit to our authority, our control, in return for food. We can make them dependent on us because they don't have food and we do. We can use it as a valuable trade item. These hunter-gatherer groups that wander all around and encounter the settled agricultural people have stuff and have traded for stuff from other people far, far away. And it's stuff that we might want, like turquoise. There's no turquoise around here, but we find it very pretty and we want it. And so we can trade food for the other things that we want that we don't have. Food is a medium of exchange. And so each group then has to make this decision at some point. Do the risks outweigh the benefits, or do the benefits outweigh the risks? Now, those groups that successfully adopt agriculture will become the most sophisticated, the most complex, and the largest of these New World human societies. But as late as the 1890s, 400 years after Columbus gets here, there's still American Indians that prefer to hunt. And so not everybody adopts this model. Now, if you do adopt the model of agriculture, of settled agriculture, staying in one place and growing your food. Question?
Why don't they do both, hunt and feed?
Some do. And even the groups that practice primarily settled agriculture, since they don't have domesticated animals, will still hunt. But we'll explain this in just a second. You're anticipating the question, I think. Good. If you decide to go agriculture, then that's going to require some social reorganization. Things don't work the same way anymore. And you've got to rethink how you structure your society. One way that you're going to have to reorganize is you're going to have to create a division of labor. When we were hunters and gatherers, that's what we did. Excuse me. Everybody hunted, everybody gathered. There was no gender-based differences. There were no age-based differences. Every able-bodied person did essentially the same job. We were hunters, we were gatherers. As we move to agriculture, though, we can create divisions of labor. Not everybody now has to do the same job, because it takes fewer people to produce the food necessary to feed the entire group. And so all of you guys over here can grow enough food not only to feed yourselves, but to feed the rest of us. And that then opens up new opportunities and new possibilities for everybody else here to do things and develop things like art and music and sculpture, and think about religion and recreation and home life and different things like that. Stuff that we think about today. Because not everybody will do the same job. Now, this division of labor also carries with it a hierarchy. You're going to start to see the emergence of a social hierarchy. And this is really true with all human groups, that as we switch to agriculture, as we start to develop these divisions of labor, different people in the society, based on what their jobs are, will have higher status than other people will. Some people will have more power, other people will have less power. And again, don't write this down, but this is a typical social hierarchy. You've got your political elite, the chiefs, the leaders, that make the rules that the rest of us go by. And then you've got the priests who can explain the natural world, explain our religious beliefs to us. They have high status, as do the merchants and the warriors who specialize in their particular trades. And then the artisans and the farmers. And then, of course, at the bottom of the social hierarchy are the slaves. And every human society has practiced slavery at some point in its development. There's always been disposable people that did the dirtiest, most grueling work and had the lowest status. And so in these more complex, the larger the group, the more complex the hierarchy, the more complex the division of labor. And some of these Native American groups, like the Aztec, the Iroquois perhaps, the Mississippians, start to develop social systems that are every bit as complicated, complex, sophisticated as what the Europeans are used to by 1492. The Aztec and a couple of the other groups, but especially the Aztec, probably provide your best example of one of the most advanced social organizations here in the New World. So let me ask you this. What are the three sisters? This is when you get your device and you're ready to go answer the question. So what are the three sisters? All right, red zone, get in. All right, and the results say the correct answer is C. Very good, 100%. I'm not going to ask you that one today. Let's bust a few myths about Native Americans. When the Europeans come over and they encounter American Indians, they're going to start to shape their own beliefs and attitudes about them. And these beliefs and attitudes are frequently wrong. They're based on a comparison with European standards that the Native Americans don't conform to. Now, at first, it's not going to be clear whose ideas, whose cultural characteristics are going to become dominant. But over time, myths start to develop based on these European perceptions. And some of these myths carry over through today. One of the myths about Native Americans is that they were our first environmentalists. I call this one the Kevin Costner Dances with Wolves myth. That all Indians revered nature so much that they never did anything to harm the environment. Now, true, the Native Americans had a different conception of the relationship between the environment and humans than the Europeans did. The Europeans, again steeped in Christianity, used the biblical description that God gave man dominion or power over all of the land and all of the animals. And it was ours to use as we see fit. Now, the basic Native American relationship then was more integrated. That humans and nature were part of a greater whole, and that the Europeans, the humans rather, interacted with nature on a more equal basis, let's say. Having said that, though, Native Americans frequently damaged the environment. Now, clearly their carbon footprint, as we would call it today, is much lighter than ours. But they harmed the environment when they believed it was necessary. For instance, they hunted some animals to extinction. Today we get pretty freaked out when little bitty spiders go extinct. But some of these Native Americans, of course, they didn't realize some of the consequences of their actions, but they hunted some species into extinction. They frequently would start forest fires to clear land for farming. Start a huge forest fire like we had out in California a while back, burns everything to the ground, and that lets the sunlight in so that your plants can grow. And so every few years they'd start these massive wildfires. Those that hunted before they got the horses, you got to ask yourself, how do you hunt buffalo without a horse and a rifle? Buffalo are big, mean animals. And so it takes a group of us to sneak up on the animal and surround it and stab it with our spears to kill it. Or we could mass kill some of these buffalo. We find a herd of buffalo peacefully grazing someplace, and we start a forest fire, or we all jump up and start yelling and screaming and running at the buffalo, and of course they want to get away from us crazy humans. And so they start running, and they run off the edge of a 100-foot cliff. 1,000 animals plunge to their deaths, so that we humans can then climb down the cliff and harvest the skin and the meat and the bones off of maybe a dozen animals, which is all that we can carry away. And the others go to waste, simply rot. And so Native Americans overkilled in many cases. Native Americans harmed the environment or altered the environment by damming rivers, altering the flow of rivers to irrigate their fields or to control floods. And that has an impact on the animals and the plants in that microenvironment. And so they were more concerned and more connected to the earth, to the environment, than certainly we are today, and more so than the Europeans believed. But they did frequently, when necessary for their survival, do things that we today would find environmentally incorrect. Another myth is that before the nasty Europeans got here, Native Americans all lived a happy and peaceful coexistence. This is a myth. That before those nasty Europeans got here and started butchering Native Americans, that all the Indians sat around the campfire smoking their peace pipes, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It was a perfect paradise of humanity. And things like jealousy and greed and hatred were unknown to Native Americans. Let me state this categorically so that there's no misunderstanding. Indians killed other Indians. and they killed other Indians for the same reasons that Europeans killed other Europeans, that Africans killed other Africans, and so on and so forth. Because of competition for resources. The group next door, trying to hunt our buffalo, will cause a conflict between us and them. Them hunting their buffalo and the buffalo stampeding across our fields causes a conflict. There could be a power struggle between two different groups to see who's going to dominate this particular region and the resources that it has. So greed and jealousy and strife are basic human emotions that Native Americans had, just like the Europeans did. Now, Native Americans fought with each other, and they did so frequently. But their methods of warfare were different. The European model of warfare, going all the way back to the Persians and the Greeks, was to amass huge armies, 40,000, 50,000 man armies, and that would clash together. And one battle could result in 50,000 people dying. Native Americans practiced a much less intensive style of warfare. The European method was to throw everything that you have at your enemy for total conquest. Native Americans fought in smaller groups, rarely probably more than 100 warriors on each side. And these groups would fight a less intensive style. It was still hand-to-hand combat, and it was still bloody in your face, and people were going to die. But fewer people died during these battles when we compare it to the European method. Now, the one exception might be the Inca down in Peru, or the Aztec who built an empire based on violence, on dominating other groups with their military, like the Europeans did. But for the most part, Native Americans practiced this less intensive style of warfare. Another myth is the myth of cultural homogeneity. Homogeneity meaning the same. Cultural sameness. Now, for the Europeans, they think that an Indian is an Indian is an Indian. They're all the same, and they're all inferior, and they're all uncivilized. Even though different European groups initially encounter different Native American groups, and as we've already said, and I hope I've beaten this point into you, that there's a great deal of cultural diversity. And so this notion that all Indians are the same is simply false. Even the Europeans noticed this as they came over in larger numbers, realized that different groups were different from each other, but they still had that mentality, you're all savages, you're all uncivilized, you're all inferior. And so instead of cultural homogeneity, we have cultural heterogeneity, meaning great differences. Another point of conflict and another myth is that concerns religion. the Europeans come over and they encounter Native Americans who have no experience with organized religion, specifically Christianity. By 1492, just about everybody in Europe is Christian. And most Europeans understand that agriculture and higher technology and Christianity is what makes people civilized. And so when the Europeans encounter American Indians who don't practice Christianity, then clearly there's going to be some cultural conflict here. But Native Americans had religion. They had religious beliefs and religious systems. For example, there's one that we call the hunting tradition. If your group primarily hunts or gathers, you probably have a similar concept of the divine. The deities, your gods that you worship, are the spirits of the animals that you depend on. And so you have groups that will create these elaborate rituals to honor, to appease the spirits of the animals. And then humans, because of our different personalities, are described as having the spirit of the wolf or the spirit of the deer or something like that. And you'll develop these, for instance, you haven't been able to kill any animals to sustain yourself. You're hungry. The babies are crying all the time. And so you have this ceremony, this ritual to appease the spirit of the deer or the elk or the bear or the buffalo or whatever animal that you happen to be hunting. And you beg this spirit to sacrifice itself for your benefit. And so there's this religious connection between the people and the animals that they hunt. It's a spiritual connection. On the other hand, if your group primarily farms, then you're what we call the agrarian tradition, or the agricultural tradition. If your group primarily farms, you don't have much use for the spirit of the deer or the spirit of the elk. In fact, you probably don't like these critters because they try to sneak in and eat your crops. Instead, your deities are the forces of nature. The sun god, the wind god, the rain god, Mother Earth, and Sky Father. And you will develop these elaborate rituals and ceremonies to honor or to appease these forces of nature. This past summer, we kind of pissed off the rain god, didn't we? Down here in South Texas. We got way too much rain. And so we would have, as Native Americans, prayed to the rain god, please, not so much rain. On the other hand, the summer before, we'd pissed off the rain god. He didn't bring us enough rain. And everybody's lawns were dying. And so we'd have a ritual to say, please bring us rain. And we'd order our lives around the sun and the phases of the moon. We'd track time based on nature. And so Native Americans had religion, but it wasn't the same style and variety. Instead, it's part of a belief system. The theologians tell us that all religions can be categorized into one of four categories. And I'll show you the matrix here. There's four basic categories of religious thought. There's natural polytheism, there's natural monotheism, there's supernatural polytheism, and then there's supernatural monotheism. Now, for now, just use abbreviations. What we've got is natural polytheism. Poly meaning many, theism meaning gods. And natural meaning that these gods are part of nature. The deer, the elk, the wind, the rain. This is where Native American religions fall. Many gods that are part of nature. On the other hand, the Europeans practice a religious belief that falls into the category of supernatural, monotheism. Mono meaning one God, and supernatural meaning that this one God exists above and beyond human perception. And so since they're on opposite corners of the matrix, you can imagine that there's going to be some conflict. Now, the Europeans are going to try to Christianize the Indians. On the other hand, the Indians never felt much of a compulsion or need to try to convince Europeans to adopt their religion. And so some religions are more, shall we say, enthusiastic about acquiring converts and followers than others are. And so again, you're going to have some cultural conflict here just over this issue of how do we worship what deities. So let me ask you this real quick. True or false? Indians rarely engaged each other in violent confrontations. All right, before you take off, remember we start counting iClicker points for real on Tuesday, and Tuesday at midnight, Chapter 1 Learn Smart assignment is due. So over the weekend, make sure that you get in, you read Chapter 1, and you finish that assignment well ahead of time so you're not stressing out. Have a good weekend. I'll see you back on Tuesday.